background of just my journey as per the topic that you had sent out. And then I'd love to answer questions from the students. Basically, that way I'll get a feel of what they are really looking for instead of my trying to tell them what they should be doing, basically. So, bottom line, I'm like most of you, most of the people who joined IIT at that time, middle class background. Dad was in the army. Mother was a doctor, but a teaching medical doctor. And, fortunately, my dad moved around, but my mother was fixed. So I was born and brought up in Calcutta, 7 years in Calcutta, then 4 years in Delhi. And then she got a Ford Foundation fellowship grant to go to the Harvard School of Public Health. And my dad was, called up for the Chinese aggression in the 62 war. And so the kids had to go to boarding school. So that's how I ended up at Doon. And when my mom came back a year later, they obviously couldn't afford two kids in boardings. So my sister, who was 3 years younger, she got pulled back to a day school. She never forgave me for that. I was left in a boarding because I was close to my senior Cambridge and they didn't want to disturb my school. So after that, I came to Kharagpur. I chose Kharagpur only because I wanted to do electronics. All the other four IITs had electrical, as did Kharagpur. But Kharagpur had a separate department of electronics, which is why I chose to come to Kharagpur, because I wanted to do electronics. And my motivation came from the fact that when my mother came back from the US, she'd got a Grundig TK20 spool tape recorder. And in those days, that was a prized possession because not too many people had it. And my dad loved it for his KL Sehgal songs. And one summer holiday, I decided to open it to have a look at what it was. And I thought I'd put it back, but it didn't work when I put it back. And so, of course, I got a big firing. And I told myself, one day I will become an engineer who'll know how to do this. Of course, I still don't know how to put it back. But that's a different thing. Uh, you know, uh, in fact, I decided that that wasn't what I wanted to do after a class with Professor Jaydas, where he made us open an ASR 33 teleprinter, which had 150 parts, and then wanted the class to put it back. And obviously, we couldn't. And of course, then he gave a big lecture, not just to us, but to Professor Maskara and everyone else around, how we'll never become engineers and no matter what we do, kind of thing. But yeah, that was IIT, 5 years. Uh, Decided, like most people in my batch, I applied overseas, but I decided to stay back. And in fact, another interesting fact was I wanted to come do my PhD and work at NASA, and basically wanted to work on satellite control systems. So when I did my electronics, computers was an option that I didn't take. I took control systems because I thought that is what I would be doing when I came to the US. Uh, Decided to stay back in India for personal reasons. Basically, I had decided who I wanted to get married to. And her dad obviously wouldn't let me get married if I didn't have a job. So I took a job, said I'll get married, then I'll come to the US. But joined DCM as a senior management trainee. And they decided to get into electronics, and I was one of the few electronics engineers in the company. So I got disproportionate responsibility 1 year out of college, after doing the management training program with them, I was asked to look at either take over R&D and production or look after national sales. Think of it, 1 year after out of college, you're suddenly in this big company, and DCM was the fourth largest company in the country at that time. You're given the responsibility of doing this. I thought, where am I going to get this kind of experience? So I decided to stay on. And really good decision because DCM did quite well in electronics. It's called DCM Data Products. We made electronic calculators, built a strong R&D, made programmable calculators, and ultimately even made a computer using bit slice technology at that time. And microprocessors were just coming out. DCM, because of the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act, which India was a socialist country at that time, felt that they should not and could not go into a new area like computers. We tried to argue with them that programmable calculators, computers are just a step. It's not something new. but large companies tend to be fairly bureaucratic in many ways. And so at that time, I really felt microprocessors were going to change the world, which they have actually. And so 6 of us left and decided to start, do it on our own. I've got to remember there was no business plan, there was no money, just bravado and the fact that we thought we knew the market and we thought we understood the technology. And that's how we started a company called Microcomp. Got some lucky breaks. I think our timing was right. Uh, as I said, we didn't have money. Fortunately, a company called Televista that used to make televisions had tried to get into electronic calculators without success. So Ved Luthra of Televista approached us and said, why don't you sell my calculators? I'll give you 90 days credit. And that's really how the company started. It started as Microcomp. We decided once we make some money, we'll invest that into developing our own computers. We started in October 1975, 15th October. I think by December, January, we decided we had enough money. We got two R&D engineers, started developing our computer, and found out that computer licenses, India was in the license Raj time, and computer licenses were reserved for state and public sector because the government in their wisdom thought that this was a very important item that India was going to make. And so we ended up signing a joint sector agreement with the UP Electronics Corporation, Uptron, as you may know it. We were the first joint venture with them. We named it Hindustan Computers Limited because we felt that when you're selling computers, you've got to look solid and have a solid name. And that worked really well for us. And that's how HCL is now the name of the company. But that's really how it got its name, and that's how we started. That's really the background. HCL, 23 years in HCL, did a number of things. We were a hardware company, very big on R&D. In fact, India was a kind of a closed economy at that time. And when we were a 3 crore company in 1980, we decided to go to Singapore because we thought our idea was we didn't want to be a big fish in a small pond. We thought it's better to be a small fish in a big pond. And so let's open the world. At 3 crores, there wasn't very much we could open, but we did get pioneer status at Singapore. And we actually we made computers there, made our computers there, but we didn't really sell hardware. We sold solutions. And we set up something called SED, Software Export Division in Madras. And basically because there were 3 flights a week between Madras and Singapore. Delhi was 1 flight a week or something in those days. And we used to send the spec back to Madras, make the program on floppies, and send the floppies back to Singapore. That's how we started that. You also got to remember that our first 8-bit commercial computer called the HCL-HP came out in the same month and year in which Apple I came out in the US. Obviously, we didn't know that at that time. Otherwise, we would have had more global ambitions earlier in life. But that we found that out much later when we came to the US in 88, 89. Yes, and I came in here basically. I was sent here. We had come here to sell hardware, and that's a long story. But basically, we morphed into services, and what you know as HCL Technologies today really got its birth at that time when we came here to the US and morphed from hardware into services, basically. Decided when I turned 50, I thought I'd worked enough because I remember on my 10th wedding anniversary, I took my wife out for dinner and she told me it's her 3rd anniversary. I said, no, your math is wrong. It's 10th. She said, no, I've been counting the days you've been traveling. It's only been 3 years since you've been sitting at home for the last 10 years. And yeah, I was on the road a lot at that time. The good news is I've seen parts of India that I probably would never have seen because the government had a policy for allowing licenses to open new units in remote areas. And so I've actually been and sold computers to people like Madura Courts at Ambasamudram and Loyal Textiles at Kovilpatti, places like that you probably never heard of, but there were big units there at that time. Decided when I turned 50, I thought, I've done enough. I've made enough money also. I might as well retire. Classic mistake, I didn't plan my retirement. I got thrown out of the house in 10 days because my wife felt I was interfering in everything at home, which, I remember she told me, we've been married for good or bad. We've been married for 27 years, but I didn't marry you for lunch. So I'll pay for a business center, go work from there. Don't sit at home and tell me this isn't right, that isn't right, whatever. So I ended up, and there were a couple of HCL guys who had left and they wanted me to come and join them, but I figured they needed money. And so they didn't need me per se. But, ended up, Goldman wanted to get into the IT services industry in India, ended up consulting with them. They wanted a squeaky clean company. We had a myriad of laws in India that didn't allow you to keep a squeaky clean company. For example, under FERA, if you had a overseas invoice that was 181 days, was paid on the 181st day, you should have gone legal on day 180. And so you were in contravention of that law. That wasn't okay with Goldman. And so trying to find a squeaky clean company in India at that time was near impossible. So I told them after 3 months that, hey, forget it, you're wasting your time and my time. If you want a squeaky clean company, why don't you start something from scratch and keep it squeaky clean? And so they said, why don't you do it? And that's how we started TechSpan in end of 98. I pulled in a lot of ex-HCL people I knew. And we basically we got our money in end of 98, and we started from 1st January 99. And those of you who remember those days, there was a bubble. Suddenly, e-commerce had come up and everyone felt brick and mortar is going to die. And e-commerce companies and valuations were crazy. So we actually rode that wave, and we did 15.4 million in our first year. We were cash positive. We were cash positive from month 11, from November that year.
Hello, baby. How are you?
Okay, sorry about that. So cash positive from month 11, and then we did 67 million in year 2000, where we actually made 4 million of profit, which is why we didn't go public, because we were being discounted for being profitable. And that sort of went against my grain, at least from where I came. And that's why we survived, I think. And then, of course, the bubble burst, everything changed. Actually, I got stuck. My father wasn't well, so I was spending a lot of time in India. He passed on in August of 2001. And then we looked at and rejuvenated the company, merged with the erstwhile James Martin and Company, who'd named themselves Headstrong. We had a joint venture with them in HCL, so I knew them. And basically did what we call a palace coup. The private equity group that had invested there wanted us to take over because the CEO they had was brought in to shut down the company, basically. And so the sort of culture in the company was, if we called anyone for a one-on-one meeting to his room, everyone thought that he'd be going out with a pink slip. And so I ended up, I remember flying to Virginia, to Dallas in mid-January 2004 to take over as CEO, and it was snowing when I landed. So the first thing I did was I called the private equity group and said, look, I'll do this job, but I'm not moving to Virginia. I'm going to live in California. And I ended up doing a dual coast existence for 7 years, basically. But, we grew, we sort of, the model we took in Headstrong was a little different. We tried to say, where is this IT services industry going to go 10 years from now? So let's build the company to look at that. And we felt that instead of just doing services and doing labor arbitrage, if we got domain experience and we talked consulting rather than labor arbitrage, that is where the industry would go. And we had a very solid delivery process, because that's what James Martin was famous for. And so we decided to focus on the capital markets or investment banks. And that's really what Headstrong did. We grew the company to, I think when we sold it, it was 220 million. And, we got a nice price. We sold it for 550 million. And I decided that, now I'd done enough. I'll now work with startups and try and sort of, the only thing I know is technology. So I thought I'll try and leverage technology or startups that are leveraging technology in education and healthcare. And that's what I'm doing today, basically working with a number of healthcare companies that are working in India and, trying to see how we can improve outcomes for the economically underprivileged, especially in India. And so that's what I'm doing with the two companies. In education, the company is doing really well. We decided to do accessibility, basically adapt digital content to the learning handicap. And while India is not yet ready for that, they're talking about it, but they're not yet. They're saying we're still struggling to educate our enabled people, the people who are okay. So handicapped will come a little later. But the US is, it's big in the US because, 20 odd percent of people in most school systems have some kind of, not visual or hearing, but ADHD, autism. There's a lot of that. Those are considered learning handicaps. And so we find the US is the market that we really are addressing with that company right now. And what we did in India was telemedicine, and that's doing quite well. We've got some 9 odd million patient records and stuff like that. But all of a sudden, the US has also taken off with that because in India, we are allowed to do a lot more than the US allows us. So if you look at it, there's a shortage of doctors in India. There are too many patients, there are too few doctors. And so we do a level of diagnostics using AI. With 9 million patient records, we can actually build a fairly good diagnostic system that helps the doctor and saves them time. And today we are seeing doctors are saving 30 to 50% of their time. And as the system gets more efficient, I'm hoping it'll go up to 70%, maybe 90% in some disciplines. So that's really what I'm doing right now. It ends up taking a lot more time than running the company because I'm alone. Right now, I don't have a support organization like you have when you're running a company. And we trying to get first-time entrepreneurs to understand how to scale. Sometimes it's easier to just do it yourself. And very often I feel like it's frustrating. You say, I can probably do this myself in less time than trying to mentor people to try and get it done. But that's life, and that's the way it is. So yeah, that's about my background. I'd be very happy to answer questions, Aditya, if you could, if the audience is interested or anyone wants to ask questions.
Hello. Yes. So thank you very much for that very candid background. I mean, I particularly enjoyed how severe risks you took. I mean, it's mind-boggling for someone in this generation to even imagine. So I would like to start off. I'd like to ask a question. Given today's day and age, as an entrepreneur, what kind of advice would you have for someone for overcoming the fear of the unknown? Meaning, someone who is just getting into it, who's just maybe done the market research, is a bit shaky on that, perhaps. Because see, you were at a time where, let's say, you said that things were beginning to open up, things were not easy in India, things were very vulnerable, the sort of variability that went on. So how does one overcome that fear? If you can shine some light on it. Yeah.
So that's a good question. So the environment when we did it in India was a very sort of licensed Raj, if I use that term, and a lot of government regulations. But the nice part of it was that there wasn't too much, or there wasn't any VC money, and therefore there weren't too many people who were competing. And so we could afford to stumble, make mistakes, get up and continue to run, so to say. That that luxury isn't there with you today. But I would say if you want to be an entrepreneur, a couple of things that's my view, is that you need to work for a while. You need to, coming straight out of college, you don't know the real world. So you need to work for a few years, understand what it is like in the real world outside of college, and then uh, get into an area you want to get into. Second thing is, don't, in my view again, don't want to become an entrepreneur to make money. I've never seen that work for anyone, except during some very strange times which don't come too often. You've got to have a passion for what you do. You've got to want to quote unquote change the world in some way with that passion. And you've got to look for a niche or an area where you think you see a gap or you see something that can be improved. Try and identify an area in a big marketplace, because if you take a niche area in a small place, I guarantee you when you get into it, you have to change strategy, you have to change your thinking in some way as you get deeper into it. And unless there's a big market you can fall back on, if it's just a small market and a niche, you'll find yourself isolated with nowhere to go when you need to make that change. The third thing I wanted to mention was try and get a good team. And I try and tell people that try and recruit people who are smarter than you. Now I know you don't think they exist, but they are there and they are around. And when you do recruit them, please try and listen to them. Because if you get smart people and you don't listen to them, they're not going to stay with you. So ultimately, remember, the press tends to highlight one person in a company because it's easy for them to identify a company with the person. But ultimately, it's not one person who runs the company or who makes a company successful. It's the team that does it, which people tend to forget because they keep reading Larry Ellison built Oracle and this Elon Musk has built Tesla. That's not true. There are a whole lot of good people in there who probably helped him do it, and without whom the individuals would not be able to do it. And the last point I want to mention is entrepreneurs, when they're starting, can't have egos. You got to have an ego when you're Larry Ellison and you've been successful, or you're a Elon Musk and you've been successful and made a lot of money. Then you can afford to have an ego. But when you're starting, you take a lot of decisions. Many of them are not right. And you have a small group of people you work with. You can call them into a room and say, we made a mistake, or I made a mistake. This is how we should do it from now on. And everyone goes out and does it in that new way. But those are your decisions. If you're the entrepreneur or the founder, and they're your mistakes, and it's easy, and you should admit to them. If you sit on your ego, you'll probably stick with the wrong decisions, and the company will probably have to suffer. And so will all the people who are working with you, and that's not fair to them. So, that's my basic advice. Work for a while, especially in India, you find, you might have great idea, you might sell it. Collecting money becomes a huge problem. You know, uh, Check it out at IIT itself. Just look at how long it takes them to pay their bills. They're from vendors who supply them stuff. And you'll get a great idea on how much follow-up is needed to get that payment out. The US is a little different, but if you're doing it in the Indian market, just remember getting payment out from people is a big, big issue. And a lot of times cash is king when you're a small company. And if you can't get your payments, you'll go under. Although you may have great sales in your profit and loss, your P&L account will look good, but your cash flow will look really great. So, you've got to learn that kind of knowledge, or that kind of uh, know-how. You get only when you're working for a while, and you sort of get exposed to some of those nuances that the market has, that people have. There's no reason why they pay late, but they just pay late because the accounts guy thinks that it's his job, and that's how he. Uh, and I think it comes from the days when we used to sell where interest rates were at 18-20%. And so obviously, if you didn't pay for a month, you made that equivalent of 1 month of 18-20% interest in the company. But those times have changed, but the attitudes haven't changed, in my view. The other problem, I think, in India, not problem, the other issue in India is that people have this thing about my company, I want to own 50% or more. In the US, we have a different structure. When the VC gives you shares, he may own 20% of the company, but he has a kind of share that has 4 votes per share compared to your 1 vote. So you may own 50% of the company, but he owns 80% of the voting. And so, in a way, that's why they call it vulture capital. Because if you don't meet your numbers for 2 quarters, they're going to change you because they've got to protect their money. That I find in India is changing, but people have this thing about my company, I want to own 50%. And a lot of times that's not the best thing for the company. And my logic is simple. I always tell people I'd rather have a small piece in a big pie than a big piece in a small pie. And so, you got to look at what are you doing it for? Are you going to build an institution? Are you going to build a company, or you want to just get it to a certain point and sell it? But again, my advice would be try and build the company. Take decisions as if you're going to be there forever. Don't try and take a decision to say, I'll position the company for sale in 2 years, because then if the market goes down like it has right now, and your 2 years become 3 or 4 years, you'll be scrambling to, get the company back in shape or do the right things, because suddenly your growth or something will slow down and it won't look good and you'll have to wait another few years to get it going. So yeah, just sorry, long answer to a short question, but
It's quite insightful. I mean, the last part of the answer, it sort of partially answers what I was about to ask next, which is about attachment. Our culture has many dictates about attachment to material things and all, and a company or a startup or whatever you want to call it, it is like some sort of an attachment to a person. What advice would you give for someone, say some venture starts to make losses, but they still sort of cling on? When do they call it quits, or how do they to adapt to it? Because the pace at which things are moving, the supply and demand, these things are moving, it's quite rapid. So what kind of advice would you have for such kinds of people?
so, if companies start making losses, there's got to be a reason why you're making the loss. Either you're in the wrong market, or you've got the wrong product, or there are multiple reasons. You have to find a way back to profitability. You just have to do that. Or you should get out quickly if you can't see a way back to profitability. And, treat it as a learning experience that, hey, my company, these are the mistakes I made. I'll try and make sure that I don't make them again. It's not that in HCL everything we uh, did well. In fact, a couple of things I'd mentioned. One is, we got to a point where the company was doing really well. We started believing that whatever we could do, or we could do whatever we did would be successful, and we decided to get into electronic cash registers, because we thought, hey, why are these guys doing it mechanically? Electronically, I can do it's much better. I'll have a record, all that kind of stuff. And so we developed our own electronic cash register, little realizing that 80 to 90% of the operation of that cash register is mechanical. That drawer has to open by itself, it has to shut, all that kind of stuff. And we were really not a mechanical company. We were really much more an electronics R&D company. And so after struggling with it for a couple of years, we ended up selling it. Well, we basically gave it away in a way to a company called Bradma of India, who were in the mechanical cash register area, but didn't know electronics. And so we just became their electronics R&D arm. But they did all the mechanical work, and I believe they were quite successful with that electronic cash register. We weren't. So try and find a home. If you can't find a way to get it, there are other people who can make it a success. You're not necessarily, maybe it needs more money, maybe it needs a bigger sales team. I don't know what the reason for the loss is, but try and find a home for it, or get out of it, because you want to The other thing I want to mention, I think, try and look at money that you get from VCs as if it's your own money. Don't try and look at it. Treat it that way. It's as if you're spending your own money in terms of expenses or whatever you do with it. And you'll find that it just builds a better company. And of course, transparency. You've got to be a transparent company. You can't be a company where you don't share information with people, then good people are not going to stay with you. So I think, some of those things, they are easier said than done. It's like saying, hey, you got to walk the talk. Everyone can say it, but actually walking the talk that you do is one of the most difficult things that you can actually do. So, yeah, that's what I would say.
I have a
Maybe,
question.
yeah,
Arjun.
yeah.
How did you draw the capital from the investors or venture capitals? How did you impress them being on a new area which nobody knew the future? So what is your secret?
So, we didn't get any venture capital. When we did HCL, the banks actually were VCs without realizing they were VCs, and all they charged you was the interest. The interest was high. We were paying 18% interest on our loans from the bank. But two things happened. So one is that you get some 60% of your stock. So if I buy something for parts, components for 100 rupees, I can give the list to the bank, and the bank takes quote unquote paper lien on it, but they give me 60 rupees as a loan against it. Number one. Number two, they do bills discounting, especially if you're selling to large customers, and you can get your payments collected in 90 days or 60 days or whatever, depending on your bills discounting limit. They give you 80% or 75% of that bill. And the third thing is I said, they give you advance against your finished goods. So I've got goods in stock in my factory. Against that, I can get an advance from the bank because I'll be shipping that out. Now, remember, when we started making computers, our margin on computers was 70% on hardware. Okay. So if components cost me 30 rupees, my selling price was 100 rupees. There, I could get 80% of 100 from the bank, but I was spending only 30 and some in process, in factory, in process overhead. So I was actually had a lot of extra money because of that margin that we had in our business. That's really how we grew HCL. In fact, now that you mentioned that 30%, I'll give you a little anecdote that might define what the environment was like at that time. So when we were selling our HCL-HC, we used to take 30% advance from the customer. That covered our bill of material, basically. And then we would get him to the factory. He would see the machine. He would then give us a check for the balance 70%. We would then pack it and ship it to him. So our first customer was a company called Remfree and Son, which was a trademark attorney in Delhi, Jyoti Sagar, who's now got his own company. But they came, he gave us the check, and we were packing the machine. When someone in the factory, I can't remember who, said, "Have you paid your excise?" We were naive, right? As I told you, we had no idea. So we said, "What's excise?" So someone told us that there's a production tax you got to pay in India. Right. So we said, sure. So we called the excise inspector and said, here, tell me what to pay. It's either ad valorem, which is a percentage of your selling price, or transformers were 4 annas per kilo by weight. So how do you look at this electronic computer? So he went through that whole manual, excise manual. All the classifications are there. There was no mini computer, microcomputer, microprocessor based, there was none of them. So he said, I can't tell you because I don't see your classification in the book. We said, what do we do? We've got a computer, we've got a customer, we've got to ship. He said, you got to write a letter to your administrative ministry. Who will write a letter to the finance ministry? Then the finance ministry will give that notification, and that's the basis on which you pay your excise. We told him, you crazy, write to 2 ministries. That's going to take 4 or 5 months at least. He said, no, this is revenue generating for the government. They'll do it in one day. But okay. And Department of Electronics had just been formed because government in their wisdom felt electronics was the future. So I still remember they used to work, we used to all work, or they used to work half-day Saturdays in those days. So we went, gave a full presentation to the Department of Electronics. And at the end of it, we said, hey, give us a letter for the finance ministry to give us the notification. So we were told that the microprocessor policy has still not been decided. We expect the policy to take 4 years. So come back 4 years later, and then we'll send the letter to the ministry. Right. So, we went back home very depressed, said, what the hell is going on? I've got machines, I've got them made, I've got money from customers, I can't ship. So we decided to take the exercise manual back home and look at it. And so going through it, import substitution was a big thing in India. Because if you imported anything, the government wanted it made in India. And so they would put a classification in there. And we used to import electromechanical accounting invoicing machines from Robotron in East Germany. And there was a photograph, there was a table with a printer and a single line display, right? And so we called and a keyboard, right? So we called the excise inspector on Monday and showed him the picture, showed him our machine, and he said, it's the same thing. So for 4 years, we cleared our machines as accounting invoicing machines. We even sold one to the Department of Electronics. That microprocessor policy did take 4 years. So, just to tell you, that was the environment we operated in.
Amazing.
At your time, Sam Pitroda wasn't in picture?
He came in a little later. He was in the picture. He was doing something called CDACT. He wanted to make, he wanted to get, telephones were in short supply. Again, it's the classic thing under the equivalent of Tatkal scheme. If you paid, 10, 12,000 rupees, I forget the amount, you could get your telephone. You could get your telephone if you paid 10, 12,000 rupees. So my mother told me, why don't you do that? She paid her money and got a phone. I told her, no, I know so many IIT Kharagpur guys, they're senior in PNT. I'll get my phone. 12 years later, I hadn't got my phone. I had to pay to get it. But, that's the way it was in those days. So it was a different environment, different world, different way you operated.
So Arjun, let me take you back into history. Back in 62, when I was 14 years old, I had my dad, like yours, was in the military. We were in Jabalpur Ordnance Factory. And so some friends, the kids were going to US to study computers. And my dad was an R&D in the defense. He said, no, computers won't amount to much. So after Kharagpur, I came to US to New Jersey. And there, it was like back in the 1970s in the US, it was a culture of physics because of Sputnik and everything else. So we were all into physics. And those of us, we were all doing graduate studies. And those who would flunk the physics or the metallurgy or mechanical department would say, okay, we need people in the computer department running computers, so you can get assistantship in the computer department. So the flunkies all entered computer science back then. But today it's exactly the opposite, right? So now when I go to Kharagpur, I go to the metallurgy department and I have to motivate them to stay in metallurgy. You don't have to go elsewhere. And as you mentioned, it's all about passion. You don't choose a field because of money. You choose a field because of your passion.
Yeah. Although mechanical guys have done well, I just want to mention Mr. Pichai is mechanical.
Right. No, he's metallurgy. He's metallurgy.
Oh, metallurgy. Sorry, I meant metallurgy people have done well. Arun Sareen is metallurgy. Right. So, we've got some fairly high-profile metallurgy graduates from IIT Kharagpur.
Right. So my first year in Kharagpur in VS Hall, I wrote to my dad I think I want to reappear for the exam, entrance exam, and go into electronics. So he writes to me. He says, you don't have to do that because as a metallurgist, you can work for any company. You can go into aerospace, you can go into electronics, you can go wherever you want. And that's what happened to me, just by chance.
Yeah. So you got to remember when we at HCL, when we started, people from the IITs, their parents wanted them to work with Hindustan Levers or L&T. Those were the companies. The risk takers were the ones who came and joined companies like HCL, IT companies. They were really the risk takers, which is one reason why so many of them have gone out and done well. And there are about 20 of them that are CEOs of companies today in and around IT services, technology, and stuff. More than that, I know from when I left HCL when did I leave them? In 99, 98. When did I leave HCL? Let me get this. 98. In the few years that I was here, in the 10 years that I was with them in the US, I know of at least 50 of the people who'd come here from HCL in the US who had started their own companies. In fact, the biggest one that people know that came out of HCL is NIIT, that I'm sure people in India have heard of. Pawar used to be a corporate planning manager way back in. So in 1980, again, that's a bit of a story. In 1980, we were selling 200 computers a year. ORG, which was a Sarabhai company, was selling 200 computers a year, and DCM was selling. They decided to get into computers after we left, and they were selling 200 computers a year. So Pawar was a
big frame was big frame
Sorry?
computers at that time. Is a big frame computers?
No. These were 8-bit, 16-bit computers. That's what. That was the big market in India. The big ones were coming in import. Those were coming in through Hinditron and other people. We weren't doing. We were doing 16-bit and 8-bit computers. But basically, Pawar came up with a plan that how we could sell 1,000 computers. And basically, the questions he asked were, where are we going to get 1,000 air conditioners? Where are we going to get 1,000 voltage stabilizers? And where are we going to get 1,000 programmers to run these computers? Because normal EDP department had unit record machines, which were patch boards, not really programming. So ultimately, he presented a white paper saying, don't look at the shortage of programmers as a problem, look at it as an opportunity. So because people are giving certificates with no training, and the word people didn't really know programming at that time, and really you can't sell computers if you don't have the programmers. And so we thought that that was a good idea. So basically, what we told him to do was, you start the company, run it. We'll give you and your team 20% of the equity, and the HCL founders took the other 80%. And that's how we funded NIIT when it started, way back in 80, 81, I think. Didn't take too much funding. I remember my share was 1.5 lakhs, which was, a lot of money in those days, very little money today, the way people look at it. But yeah. But you remember my salary at that time was, I think it was 6,000 rupees a month. So 1.5 lakhs was a lot of money. Yeah, so that's how NIIT started. Just as a
Sir, I had a question.
Yeah.
So I'm currently in my 4th year at KGP itself, and somewhere in my 3rd year, like me and a couple of friends of mine, like while talking to seniors during the convocation, we got inspired and we decided to start up. And for the next 6-7 months, we worked on our product and everything. But we had a discussion and we realized that somewhere our plans in the future did not align. We had plans of higher education and a lot of other things. So what advice do you have when someone is making this decision of whether you want to continue with the startup, go for higher education and come back, or any other way?
So it depends on the individual. Very difficult to say what advice I would give. It depends on your circumstances and what you do. I look at what I did. I wanted to get married. I decided who I wanted to get married to. She was the sister of a dear friend and a batchmate of mine from IIT. And I stayed back in India because that was my priority. I always claim that's how I became an entrepreneur. I took the biggest decision of my life when I was, 21 years old or less. And, that has dictated my whole life after that in a way. So you've got to look at what your circumstances are. Some people come from a background where the family needs their income to supplement whatever they have. Then being selfish and saying, I want to start a company, unless you're really, really passionate about it, becomes very difficult. The family will always support you, or most of the time will support you, but you also have to be responsible and take a decision that you have to sacrifice something for them. So I would think you have to look at your own circumstances, decide what you want to do. And just remember one thing, the idea you have today, if you want to go for higher education and come back and do the same thing, it's unlikely that that space will be available a year or two from now. Today's world, anything you get into, there are 10 people, a whole lot of people who are already in there. So you have to be fast, and really, that's why VCs come in. They give you the money to be able to, do things quickly. That wasn't true in our time. So it's really an individual decision. Very difficult for me to say what you should do. And ultimately, no one can tell you. You have to decide. And since you're doing engineering, one of the simplest ways to decide is when you're confused, try and make it a little more objective. Put down the reasons, give value to points to each reason, total it up. It won't solve your problem, but it'll give you an easier frame in which to look at that whole thing. But the decision is yours, and those are quote unquote, that's why they call decisions. And if you're going to be an entrepreneur, you have to take decisions.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that answers it in some way. I'm sorry I can't give you a solution.
No, I understand. Makes sense.
So, Arjun, I have a couple of comments. This is Ron Gupta. And Arjun has been so omnipotent that he's there everywhere, doing everything that needs to be done. Years back, in our IIT days, we were in the same batch, but I don't think we ever met. I don't think we met for almost 50 years. But I'm impressed by everything he's done in any position. And I've been doing things on the side, somewhat different, in a different way. Having worked in the data center industry, planning, building, designing, commissioning, decommissioning, all of that work. Then I retired full-time, but involved with the IIT, KGP, and other associations, where I think we've done well. 2 days ago, we announced the conference, 2023 Pan-IIT conference, we are going to hold in Washington, D.C. at the Washington, D.C. Conference Center with an expected attendance of about 2,500 people in person, and in the time frame of October to December 2023. We already have about 30 grand chairs who will donate, hopefully, up to $50,000 each. Many, many more on the list, including some here, and some big names that we would like to get. And we would like our participation by everybody there. And that's all I have to say. So please do participate, and you all will get the information on a very, very regular basis. And Arjun, you are like the king. Stay that way. I'll take
Ron,
my Singh name and I'll add that to your name.
thank you, Ron. And you're being very humble. Ron has actually been uh, the real organizer in our group to have our get-togethers for our Golden Jubilee year and earlier. And he's also endowed the infrastructure school at IIT Kharagpur. Plus, some chair professors in the names of his friends who unfortunately are not with us today. But thank you, Ron. Thank you.
So,
Aditya, any other questions?
I think there's another. So let's have this as the last question. It's Soham Banerjee. We winding up this.
Yeah, thank you, Aditya. Hi, my name is Shoham, and I work at IIT Kharagpur, and I have been working in digital primary care, evidence-based primary care, especially for the in the rural settings for a few years. And I also have a startup. So actually, sir, you have answered a couple of questions I had about entrepreneurship. So my question is very specific to the like you said that you are mentoring a few startups who are working in health tech and ed tech as well. My question is, what are the challenges do you see the startups facing in terms of when they work in digital primary care, especially solving a social cause or working with the government to make the primary healthcare better in India, especially. And my second question is, being a technology startup, as we have developed something very good from very bootstrap, and then how do you protect your idea in terms of in technology startup there are big market players, they can replicate your idea or copy your idea in like few days and develop a product that you have worked for like say 3 years for the last 3 years. So how do you protect your idea? That is my second question.
So, I'll answer the second question first. You can't protect an idea. You have to protect, you have to either get a patent or a trademark or something to protect what you want to protect. If you can't do that, then really it's very difficult to, you're never going to be the most efficient in terms of what you do. Someone will always come in and do it better, whether large or small. And so you have to, if you want VCs to fund you, you have to show them what you call a barrier to entry. Either you're the first mover and you move really fast like Facebook did and get a whole lot of people, and then it's difficult for someone to come in because to come in they have to spend a lot of money, or that, as they put it, that barrier to entry is high, and therefore you built a nice high barrier. They have to climb a high wall before they get in to your enclosure. And so that's this answer to the second question. To the first question, there are lots of, first thing is when you go into rural areas, my view is that if you're going to go out with a begging bowl like an NGO all the time, you're never going to be able to scale it, or the scaling will take a long time, right? So best thing to do is to find a way of making it self-sustaining. So now if you've got the model that's self-sustaining, ultimately you're going to get this person in the rural area to pay you 20 rupees, 50 rupees, some amount of money per consultation that they get, remote consultation. They can always come to a government hospital and pay 2 rupees and get, because in a very inconvenient way, get what they need to get. But once you decide that, then now you have to justify that. How do you charge them 25 rupees, for example, for whatever consultation you do? Invariably, it'll be a 18-month, 15-month, 24-month turnaround before they see the value of what you're doing and are willing to pay. That's been my experience with a lot of rural areas. And so you will have to find the funding for those 24 months and maybe after that, you can start recovering some of that over a period of time. Second thing is, If you are coming in from the outside and telling them how to do things, it's never going to work. You have to get the community involved in getting it done. And so, in a way, you have to find a model where the community gets involved in doing that. Most people living in the village want a better quality of life, but they don't know how to do it, and they haven't been able to do it. And they don't trust anyone because, unfortunately, the government has come up with a lot of schemes that are very good on paper, but never seem to get implemented right. And in my experience is, except for some exceptional cases, most of the block development officer or whoever is supposed to do it is not interested in doing it. And he's more a power center than an enabler. And that is the big problem. And they see you exactly the same way when you go in. So, for example, when we were looking at doing maternal health and infant mortality, trying to address that problem in Rajasthan, we discovered that the girls going to school in class 9 and class 11, when they don't have board exams, became our army who would go out and get us information and were able to talk to mother-in-laws in the village because most of them are not educated, and they trust these girls who are getting educated and get them to make sure that their daughter-in-laws who are expecting take care of simple things like, if you're expecting, don't lift a full bucket of water. You're not supposed to do that. It can have an impact. Go get your vaccinations done. Go, go to the primary health center or the community health center every so many days to get a checkup or whatever. So we were able to use them as an army to get all this done. And you'll have to find a way of getting the community involved, because then it's sustainable. After you go away, it'll keep happening. Otherwise, you'll do it for a while, you go away, it'll stop, and that'll be the end of it. So that's been my experience in rural India. And again, for those of many of us like me who I've always lived in a city my whole life. When I first went out and worked, and well, I didn't work, but saw what was being done and what is rural India, I realized that there are two countries. India is not one country. India is two countries. And one part of it, a lot of us don't even know about. At least I didn't know about it. And for some reason, while the government talks about it, for 75 years, they've done very little. They've set up very good infrastructure. For example, you have the ASHA worker, you have the Anganwadi worker, you have the auxiliary nurse midwife in the villages. But how effective are they? And how are we enabling them to become effective? Those are some of the big problems in India. The infrastructure exists. On paper, it looks very good, but the effectiveness is really, really grim. And technology can help because they're all supposed to share information, which they have in 11 registers. They meet once every 2 weeks and they're supposed to match these registers. It doesn't happen. It can't happen. So if you give them a tablet or a smartphone, the match is immediate. Everyone gets the same information. They have it right then. They know what to prioritize. So technology can play a big role in solving some of these problems that exist today and make them more effective. I'm not saying you've got to change everything. A lot of the infrastructure is there. We just have to make it effective or find a way to make it effective. Sorry, you're getting into an area that I'm emotionally involved. So, I hope that answers it, Saurabh.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I have a few follow-up questions, but I will talk to Ritu and take it offline.
Yeah. Just email it to me. I'll be happy to answer them.
Sure,
I'm traveling
sure.
the next
Thank you
few
so
days,
much.
but I'll be happy. Anyone has questions, just get my email, send it to me, and I'll be happy to either call you back or answer them. Okay. Hi, CS. Good to see you.
Hi, Arjun. It was really good to listen to you any number of times. Okay. Like you've been an inspirational lesson both from what you have founded and helped us form that MNFIC Innovation Center. And prior to that, the School of Telecommunication. And as usual, whenever you've been visiting us, right from the time you were at HCL, the kind of things you were doing as an entrepreneur yourself, and then doing so much for the institute and creating opportunities within the institute now for all to experience it. So it was a pleasure listening to you. But now I have a small query. I mean, it's not a query, but it's something where I would seek some kind of suggestion. Maybe you can do it later also. We are now slowly moving to the situation where institutes are also having to play a part in incubating startups, institute like ours also, and support them to the extent that they can also grow up and flourish. It's something that we have not been so proficient in doing before. We're good in doing education, teaching, doing classes and all that, it's fine. But when you want to support a startup, you have to act like something like a venture capitalist does, give some funds and see how this is, how they can progress from it. So we see situations wherein people are like very young students coming with practically nothing in their pockets. They say they don't want to depend on parental income or anything, nothing. And then they have almost nothing, no salary to draw from if when you're in the startup phase. But they have good ideas, good ways. They have even something proven, some patents showing something to work, but they can't draw salary. On the other hand, if the industry is there to take manpower, which will pay a pretty high salary, and they find it not easy to get that kind of manpower to themselves. So in such a scenario, what kind of advice can we give? I mean, we see that students can get very good salaries from other sources, but if they are as in a part of a startup, there is hardly any fund to support themselves. To pay their own thing, because if they receive something, they would like to do it to make their product rather than pay themselves.
No, we'll talk about it, Kumar. I don't know if this is the time when we can discuss that and come to any kind of solution. But let's talk about it separately. That's a long discussion. But just want to mention the government of India is talking, and they're working with some of us they're talking of wanting to start 1 million startups in India. Now, the problem is, where do you get mentors? How do you do this? And so I'm working with the Invest India people to try and see how we can address this in some way. Try and get multiple accelerators and people together to see if it's possible. If the target is 1 million startups in India, how are we going to do this? Because the government has a target, but they've said they'll create 10 million jobs. They can't create 10 million jobs. So they want to now create job creators who will create the 10 million jobs, which is probably the way to go. But as I said, it's a problem we are discussing. There are lots of ideas that are up there. I'll come in and talk to you guys sometime about it, and we'll have to decide what strategy or strategies you want to follow at IIT Kharagpur. Some of the others are doing, some of the other institutes, IITs and IIMs are also doing some work. And so there are different experiments going on. We'll just have to stay on top of them and see which ones work. And the other variable here is every region is different. Bengal is going to be different to the way it's done in Delhi, or the way it's done in Hyderabad, or the way it's done in Mandi, any of the other IITs. So we'll have to keep some local nuances in mind while doing this. And the big issue we have at Kharagpur is that you have very little industry in your hinterland. If you had industry in your hinterland, the problem would have been a little different. Having no industry in your hinterland, we have to look at it a little differently. So we'll talk about it. I think this is not the time. I'll keep that as a problem, and I'll try and keep you guys updated as things progress with the Invest India folks who are looking at this 1 million startups.
Yeah, thanks, and we'll look forward to whenever you come. And
Sure.
Once again, thanks for this kind of very nice talk you gave candidly to all. It was really good to listen to.
Not
this.
at all. Thanks. I've got to run. It's now 15 minutes past the hour. So
Thank you very much.
thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for attending, and really appreciate it. Bye now.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening and have a good
Yeah,
day.
all of
Bye
you,
bye.
yeah. Take care. Bye.